Hi, everybody. I'm Pat Collier. I'm here at Ball State, and I'll be respondent and host for our final panel today. I'll introduce the speakers one at a time. And so our first speaker is Joan Shelley Rubin. She's professor of history at the University of Rochester and the author, among other things, of The Making of Middlebrow Culture and Songs of Ourselves, The Uses of Poetry in America. She is co-editor of A History of the Book in America, Volume 5, the enduring book, and the Oxford Companion to the book. And I'll turn it over to Joan Shelley Rubin.
The enduring book was a kind of a hope. That's her title. I hope we're right. At any rate, my paper interrogates the concept of print culture beyond the metropolis, by exploring the double presence of local ties and cosmopolitan influences in the career of the upstate New York newspaperman George Chandler Bragdon. As I say in the paper, one of the gifts of the history of the book to historical study, I think, is to make us rethink boundaries. And I use the case of Bragdon to highlight the fluidity of the boundary between the rural and the metropolitan, observing that institutions and practices that preserved local distinctiveness coexisted with elements of print culture that drew active readers and writers into urban-based national networks and cosmopolitan ways of thinking. At the same time, recognizing the pejorative connotations of the word provincial and the multiple appropriations of the term cosmopolitan, I employ those categories provisionally so as to raise the problem of finding a language with which to discuss the tensions I describe. In the paper, I begin by characterizing George Chandler Bragdon as a restless reader. And I got quite fascinated by his letters from the 1850s that chronicle his religious struggles. I actually think they're a wonderful resource for a religious historian because he was set on a career for a while in the Presbyterian ministry, and then he canceled those plans partly as a result of his reading. I have schooled myself in doubt, he wrote to his future wife in the summer of 1858, and it is very hard indeed for an habitually doubtful mind to exercise strong faith. And instead, I note that Bragdon gravitated toward Emerson, toward the canon of Victorian poets, and eventually toward alternative spiritualities, culminating in a fascination with theosophy. At the same time, however, he adopted a critical stance as a reader of fiction that accorded with a view of himself as part of a network of educated individuals widening out from New England. And I love the anecdote that I tell of his teaching school in Centralia, Illinois, surrounded by people he thought were ignorant. I hope nobody here is from there, and in which he then says he has to continue his subscription to the Atlantic Monthly because, he wrote, "I know not how to do without it." So what I'm going to do is actually to hit the highlights of his career, which will remind those of you who had a chance to read the paper of what they were and fill those of you who couldn't quite get to it in. He left Illinois. He went back to the area where he had been born on the shores of Lake Ontario, and he took up a position as a country editor. In assuming that occupation, Bragdon joined the group that one 19th century writer dubbed the ignis fatuus of the press. Peripatetic individuals who bought a local paper, stayed a year or two, sold their interest. These are like real estate transactions, it seems to me. And then they move on to the next small community and they do the same thing all over again. So Bragdon started out in Watertown, New York. He moved after a bit to Utica, New York, and then beginning in early 1865, he spent 3 years publishing a weekly in the Jefferson County town of Adams, New York, really village of Adams, New York. Bragdon's experience in these settings integrated the local and the cosmopolitan in three ways. First, the political affiliations he sustained as a journalist both intensified county and state loyalties while providing entree to the national political scene. Bragdon was a Republican, and he depended on the largesse of local Republican politicians to secure government contracts for job printing. Thinking of James Raven's paper this morning. At the same time, he was connected to the controversial Republican Party boss and congressional leader, Roscoe Conkling. He was mixed up with Roscoe Conkling, whom he met in his Utica boarding house. By 1870, Roscoe Conkling had secured control over the most important patronage vehicle in the country, which was the New York Customs House, and he exerted a spellbinding effect over President Grant. Received advertisement of U.S. loan, Bragdon recorded in his journal in 1865, for which I suppose I am indebted to Conkling. This relationship was obviously local in origin, and yet it allowed Bragdon a glimpse of and a link to the highest level of American government, arguably lending him a sense of participation in the metropolises of Washington and New York City. Secondly, Bragdon's entanglement with both small-town and metropolitan milieus is reflected in the actual contents of the newspapers with which he was affiliated at this point in his career. And I know that many of you are familiar with what these 19th century small-town papers looked like, but I was particularly interested in the system of the exchange, which enabled newspapers to clip and publish articles from other papers and magazines in order to fill their pages. Because it seemed to me that that system as an institution could foster greater identification with a national and even international outlook than the term country editor might by itself suggest. So the Adams Visitor, which was the paper that he started in 1865, was 4 pages. 2 of the pages were dedicated to the publication of legal notices and local advertising. There was local advertising on the other 2 pages as well, but many of the features on the front page of the paper gave it something of a cosmopolitan or at least an international element, with stories about Paris or the Pyrenees that were gleaned from the exchange. And in addition, the paper carried book reviews with the imprimatur of the Metropolis. For example, recommendations for 2 volumes of the Diamond Dickens from the Boston Commonwealth and the New York Christian Advocate. Third, for Bragdon, print culture fostered relationships and activities outside of the workplace that straddled the divide between localism and cosmopolitanism. In Watertown, for instance, he enjoyed the tutelage of a village radical who recommended books of free thought and occult philosophy. This friendship, this sort of mentor relationship, was part of the local context in which Bragdon operated in the 1860s, and yet this reading pushed him beyond provincial attachments. At the same time, the lecture and concert circuit brought the metropolis upstate. Furthermore, by involving Bragdon in religious speculation and debate, his membership in the Adams Literary and Scientific Association, a kind of book club, a form of literary sociability, could foster broad-mindedness even as it relied on and strengthened local networks. Bragdon's relocation to Ithaca, New York in the spring of 1868 created an additional site at which the double presence of country journalism and cosmopolitan print culture asserted itself. And here the paper was called the Ithacan. The announced purpose of the paper was to give a full and accurate record of village and county matters. But at the same time, of course, the newly founded Cornell University was up and running, and it was part of Bragdon's purpose to showcase in the paper articles about the exemplars of transatlantic liberal culture who were at Cornell, and to offer sophisticated literary columns to the paper's audience of well-educated readers. I was interested in the fact that at this point in his career, after the Ithacan was bought up by somebody else, Bragdon moved to New York City because it intrigued me that his transition to New York seemed so seamless. He seemed prepared for it by experience and by sensibility. Notably, in New York, he participated in groups that explicitly called themselves cosmopolitan, using the term as a synonym for progressive or forward thinking. But when the paper that brought him to New York City failed, he went back to small-town editorial work, slipping into the city, slipping out again. In Dansville, New York, in the early 1870s, he replicated the pattern of literary sociability he had established earlier, becoming a charter member of a reading group known as the Coterie that depended on local ties, but aspired, as these groups did all over the country, to cultivate familiarity with a broad range of Western and non-Western historical and literary subjects. At this time, Bragdon was also active in the New York Press Association, and that was an organization of country editors with a decidedly provincial cast, but it nevertheless fostered interstate connections, held conventions in New York City, Washington, and Boston, helped to heal some of the rifts of the Civil War, enabled the editors to identify with their metropolitan counterparts and to imagine themselves as citizens of the nation as a whole. In 1884, Bragdon's career as an ignis fatuus of the press drew to a close. He moved to the emerging metropolis of Rochester and worked on and off for Rochester papers, eventually ceasing full-time employment and concentrating on freelance writing. Here he was active in the Vagabond Club, a group of self-styled cosmopolitans in which his son Claude, an architect, and incidentally, Brad, a friend of Gillette Burgess,
was he?
Claude was, likewise participated. This is the son. But the father also widened his intellectual horizons at this time through his membership in theosophical circles. He returned temporarily to Dansville in 1899 and remarked, "I notice how narrowing prolonged village life is." And yet, local institutions of print culture continue to be important. And so when he brings out his book of poetry, it's a regional publisher in Oswego, New York, that brings the book to the public. At this juncture, Bragdon also found a niche as a local historian, producing accounts of New York counties, and in 1901, a compendium entitled Notable Men of Rochester and Vicinity. When he died in 1910, George Chandler Bragdon was characterized as a journalist of the old school, a figure distinct from the American moderns who would populate New York City and assert a cosmopolitan sensibility compounded of sexual freedom, radical politics, artistic experimentation, feminism, and disdain for small-town America. By contrast, Bragdon affords an example of a cosmopolitanism acquired in and limited by the home library, the country newspaper office of the State Press Association, the Upstate New York Lecture Hall, and the Literary Club. To look beyond the metropolis in the mid-19th and late 19th century in America is thus to understand that cosmopolitan mentalities are multifaceted and variable over time, that they can exist in tension with locally based political, personal, and literary relationships, and that print culture can support both sets of ideals and loyalties. It is also to become familiar with residents of America's rural areas and small towns for whom the metropolis, however geographically distant, was always there. Thank you.
Thanks. And our second speaker is Brad Evans. Brad is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University. His work has explored the relationship between the history of anthropology and late 19th and early 20th century American literature, with a focus on the circulation of culture. And this is the jumping-off point for his current project on the international vogue for, quotes, ephemeral bibelots. His working title for this book is Black Cats, Butterflies, and the Bibelots.
Thanks. And I had no idea that this was going to work so well. This is a 1-2 punch, because this is really, this is the follow-up. If Bragdon had lived, if he was a bit younger, I'm sure he would have been part of the Vagabonds himself, and he would have probably been hanging out with my friend Gillette Burgess and doing little magazines. So this is a paper about the movement of movements. And it's not book history per se, and it's not really a history of reading per se, but rather it's the history of an assemblage or a linking of reflexivity about circulation itself that in the 1890s and early 20th century becomes the grounds for the artistic movement that we know as modernism, most recognizable in things like Dada. Since this is this has already started. This is just going to go on in the back. It has a great kind of visual side to it, and since this is the last panel of the day, I thought look at some nice pictures. Yeah. So this paper is drawn from a book.
I promised to keep that on the table. I just wanted to be able to see.
This is going to stop probably sooner than I thought, but we'll see. So it's drawn up from a book on a late 19th century craze for what were known then as ephemeral bibelots, little magazines, hundreds of them, that were published around the world for an exceptionally brief period of time in the 1890s. The book will clarify a few ideas about the prehistory then of the more well-known modernist little magazine movement from the 1910s and 1920s. And at the same time, try to expand with this worldview the history of American literature in the late 19th century. As I mentioned in passing in the paper, these were such marginal things that most of the bibelot that I'm describing lie largely outside the purview of Google acquisitions, which might allow us to reflect a little bit on what their existence can tell us about the current state of archival research in the humanities. The book, I think, is also somewhat innovative for its use of network theory to think about print circulation, and you get a small taste of that in the paper. So it moves the discussions out of the Anglo-American context by including the French Petite Revue, where the fad began, and also some from far afield, including those from Russia, which Chekhov published his early short stories in. And you get a taste of this. This is the Russian skinny magazines, like Oskolky. And also others that I don't discuss. For example, one from written in Bengali, whose editor was Rabindranath Tagore, and he was working in that in 1895. It also tries to get from these places back to small towns in the Midwest, and so if not entirely to Muncie, at least to places like Lansing and Wausau, Wisconsin. So with this in mind, we've already flipped through it. So with this in mind, I'll try to outline the problem that the paper addressed. It's abundantly clear that the hundreds of ephemeral bibelots published in the United States between 1894 and 1898, a very precise period of time. You can see a curve. It goes up, it comes down. They still maintain a little bit after 98. They go back up a little bit in the early 1900s. But basically, this is a fad. It's clear that they were looking to Paris, not only for inspiration, but also as a kind of marker or index of their artistic purpose. There are many reasons for this, but two stick out. First, there was simply a lot happening socially and artistically in Paris at the time, from the countercultural urban nightlife described most recently by Daniel Tiffany in Infidel Poetics, to the intense development of the field of art as an autonomous international institution described by Pascal Casanova. Paris truly was the capital of modernity, and the American artists I'm interested in were no less immune than others to its gravitational pull. The second, though, and just as important, was that Paris became, for the American bibelotists, a symbolic index of revolutionary intent. It served as a marker with which they could distinguish themselves from the gentility of the Boston-based illustrated magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and the consumerism of the mass market monthlies, as well as from the conventionality of American realism as it had taken shape under the tutelage of William Dean Howells. The American Bibelotists wanted not to be provincial Americans, but cosmopolitan internationalists, not to be prudish and Protestant, but sexually libertine, a little bit decadent, not to be serious like the Boston Brahmins, but comedic and young, like the poets, painters, performers, and prostitutes converging on the cabarets in Montmartre. Indexing the Parisian Petite Revue became shorthand for these qualitative differences. It's not the story that I really tell in this paper, but the French influence on the American Little Magazine movement, and thus its influence on some of the most important late 19th century American writers, is in itself an important one to tell, I think, if for no other reason than that it has gone almost entirely unremarked. It makes us rethink what we think we know about American realism and naturalism by putting works we thought we understood in entirely different contexts, and also by grounding the glimpses we have had of the aesthetic projects of certain authors in much more solid historical detail. And I won't go into it, but I don't know if you certainly can't see from back there, but on the left is a poem by Stephen Crane. And so most of Crane's poetry was published in a magazine, the little magazine, The Philistine. And for a long time, scholars have looked to say that Crane was both a naturalist and also inspired by symbolism, but never really able to put their finger on what the symbolism part of Crane's work means. But when you look at its context within these little magazines, which were clearly indebted to what was, not just indebted, but they knew exactly what was happening in France at this time, then certain things begin to make sense. And for example, the last line of this poem, and I think Crane's poetry is really quite empty. It only makes sense within this context. Otherwise, it's quite like rate. The last line of this poem, Comrade Brother, is quoting Baudelaire, right? And it's the same line that T.S. Eliot quotes in The Wasteland, Hypocrite Lecture. And Crane's doing it in the 90s. And Eliot, who does it in the 20s, this becomes the high mark of American modernism, the fact that it's rediscovered or discovered for the first time French symbolism, whereas Crane in the 90s was clearly doing the same thing. But even more tellingly, I think that when Crane quotes it here, I could go into detail, but he's also quoting Whitman at the same time. So he's taking Baudelaire, putting him alongside Whitman. Crane becomes a different person when seen in these magazines. The paper actually poses a rather different problem, and namely, I was interested in thinking about how movements move and how artistic vogues catch their wave. And in this respect, the ephemeral bibelots are particularly useful for two reasons. First, the vogue was short-lived. From 1892 to 1894, it's just taking shape. It hit its peak in 96. It's over by 98. The ephemeral bibelots thus offer a good sample for thinking about vogue and ephemera, how movements take their shape and really also how they fall apart. Second, and this was the real focus of the paper, there's a huge paradox in thinking about the bibelot movement as a movement, given that the bibelots didn't actually move. Their circulation was so limited. The traditional ways we have for thinking about magazines and circulation, especially in terms of things like subscription, periodicity, longevity, advertising, do not account for the manner in which the bibelots seem to have circulated without actually having anything in the way of a distribution system. Even the most popular of the little magazines had very small print runs, and what we can tell from the library records and anecdotal evidence suggests that they had exceptionally limited distributions. As I suggest in the paper, the French Petites Revues were not circulated outside of France except informally, nor did the American bibelot travel in the other direction. So then, given the obvious lines of influence, I wanted to think rather systematically about what travels. In what world does it make sense to think of Le Chat Noir from Paris and the Clack Book from Lansing, Michigan, not to mention the Russian skinny magazines like Oskolki, as part of the same movement? This means thinking in rather different ways about print circulation than what one finds in other accounts of cosmopolitanism. A rather looser definition of circulation that depends not on the movement of books or bodies, but rather, I argue, of various forms of citational references. And in the paper, I adopt the language of network theory to address this problem and start by thinking not about circulation, but about blockages to circulation, the structural holes and non-intersecting parallel planes that keep the routes of circulation from developing. I then outline 4 citational modes that seem to develop around these blockages, and which I argue define not only the art of the bibelot, but also the development in the late 19th century of a modernist aesthetic public sphere. The 4, just to recall, are authors and artists, conceived of not so much as the producers of texts, but as points of reference. Translations and the lack thereof, genres, and in particular blurbs and stories without words. And there are a couple of quick visuals of these ones. Does this move? Oh, I went to the end. So the Gillette Burgess, who I mentioned, coined the word blurb, and this is the book that he did it in. He did it later, but Burgess was a key to this movement, starting in with the very first American magazine. So I think it says something that the blurb becomes an art form, which he then goes on to name. This is from Le Chat Noir, so a story without words. The line at the bottom, Comment on devient anarchiste, how you become an anarchist. And it's a little girl with her sand castle getting destroyed in various fashions. Burgess does a similar kind of story without words on the pages of the Lark. This is an example of the fumism that I describe. This comes in the style. This is the 4th one. A kind of very cutting form of parody, sending things up in smoke. This is a Vogue cover, Le Chat Noir, the black cat on the model's head, which has a long kind of inside pun. But the idea was that in France, Le Chat Noir was a sexual pun in the same way that you'd expect it to be here. It's a black pussy. The model is wearing her black cat out on her head, which Vogue is clearly making a statement about when young debutantes do when they sell themselves on the marriage market. But the black cat ends up showing up all over the place in the American bibelots, and it's always exactly the same black cat, versions of this cat with big saucer-like eyes and an erect tail. And this is from the Petit Journal de Refusé, another Burgess production. It's the purple cow, which I talk about in the paper. This was just Monk's The Scream, which shows up in Mamselle, New York in 1896. And then we finish with a couple pictures of the Clack book, which this one I think is the telling. If an image is to suffice for an argument, this would be the one, which is how do we imagine the links between these different kinds of birds? The Clack book, which is clearly playing on the lark. It is a lark. And the Merleton, which was a French petite revue, where the link, I think, is a little bit less clear. But it seems to me that these authors all knew of the others, and I think were playing on each other. So the Bibelot movement, I suggest, moved in little... I conclude with a discussion of what conceptualizing circulation in this way means for thinking about the assemblage of modernism in places like Muncie and about its links to Paris and Moscow. The Bibelot movement, I suggest, moved in little pieces by the assemblage of links. The sense people had of it as a movement came from the swarming multiplication of these minor links along very precise, scale-free networks. And the movement moved through citational points of reference, not geographical ones, linking the Lansings and the Walsals of the world to the aesthetic public sphere, if not to the world republic of letters. Returning to the project as a whole, I think what I look at is not dissemination per se, but the way that dissemination becomes the grounds for artistic innovation, the modernist aesthetic public sphere.
All right. Thank you very much, Brad. I should probably start by gesturing towards Joan's paper and the sort of imbrication of the Cosmopolitan and the Provincial, just by saying that I was born in a tiny coal town in Pennsylvania, but now that I live in Indiana, when people ask me where I'm from, I say Philadelphia. So what I'm going to try to do here with my time is I'm going to introduce a set of keywords, theoretical concepts that I think will help to link these two papers and also sort of open up some problematics both in the papers and in the keywords, and also link back to the papers we've seen today and forwards to what we're going to hear tomorrow. None of these are unfamiliar or esoteric or cutting-edge words. They're all terms. They're all very familiar theoretical terms. I think they raise several interesting and I think important theoretical questions that speak to the larger topic of the conference. Several of my terms are borrowed from post-colonial studies, and thus they also gesture towards some of tomorrow's essays. And all of my keywords foreground the power relations inherent in print culture. The larger questions the terms, when applied to today's papers, raise are, to what extent can critical concepts fashioned to deal with colonial and imperial situations be adapted to the relations between metropolitan and provincial settings? And I'll quickly note here that the imperial notion of center and periphery is at work implicitly in the phrase beyond the metropolis. Second, and more broadly, to what extent and in what ways precisely can the relation between metropole and province be understood as a power relation? The second question goes to what sorts of adaptations are necessary if, as I suggest, we're going to take vocabularies from post-colonial theory and from kind of critical gender theory and apply them to the question of metropole and province. And so my terms are, and I'm going to run through these kind of one at a time, and I'm going to hurry a little bit at the end and be more provocative and less well-grounded at the end. Public sphere, cultural capital, imagined communities, performativity, hybridity, double consciousness. So first of all, public sphere. Brad Evans argues that the Bibelo movement, quote, in effect redefined the aesthetic public sphere by turning the network into a kind of formalist artifact. The network itself becomes an aesthetic, yeah? Mm-hmm. The Bibelo movement redefined the public sphere by turning it into, quote, the space of a different kind of circulation, one in which frenetic citational strategies assembled an ever-expanding network whose most important work was not done in linking far-apart clusters, but rather in further and further articulating the function of the cluster itself, so that with a relatively weak and anomalous bridge, say, between Wausau and New York, a cluster that functions in the same way as that of the French Petit Revue could pop up in the upper Midwest and function in essentially the same way. Did I understand that? Okay. Evans' usage of the term here, the term public sphere here, would seem to implicitly define public sphere as, quote, would seem to implicitly define public sphere as the space in which networked connections are made. Taking the term public sphere back to its more conventional usage, as defined by Jürgen Habermas and the school of theory derived from his work, though, highlights the question of content in Evans's model. For Habermas, the public sphere is the space of social institutions and practices in which matters of public interest are debated with the aim of arriving at the truth, or in what Habermas would describe as the decadent phase of the bourgeois public sphere, when class or interest groups contend with one another to decide matters of public interest. It's conventional to think of the literary public sphere as functioning in ways that are parallel to the larger bourgeois public sphere. And indeed, Habermas believed that Enlightenment norms of free speech and public debate arose out of 18th century literary culture. It's tempting to describe the French Petit Revue and the Bibelots as demarking what Nancy Armstrong calls counter-public spheres. These are basically little miniature public spheres in which items of local interest can be debated among the subgroup, and so that their differences and strategies can be ironed out and then be visited onto the main public sphere. The sort of best example of this would be like second wave feminism, where it has its kind of own little institutions of debate and discussion, which, you know, argue terms and strategies, and then with the aim of visiting these on the sort of central cultural discussion. The case of the Bibelots, of course, is different. They seek not to access the bourgeois public sphere, but to blow it to bits. It thus may be best to describe the Petit Revue and the Bibelots as constituting or assembling, in Evans's language, an anti-public sphere, a kind of network and a kind of networked activity that seeks not to achieve dialogue with the mainstream, but to replace it, whose oppositionality is not aimed at reform, but the replacement of bourgeois notions of reform and dialogue with citationality. Rubin's essay raises another concept from public sphere theory, what Habermas respondents Oscar Nett and Alexander Kluge call the mediation of the life world. This is the mediation of the life world addresses the degree to which the very categories through which we experience our lives are categories that, the categories that substantially constitute, in Rubin's terms, the lived experience of individuals, are categories that we consume from media. This condition is, of course, more obvious to us in our hypermediated age, but Rubin's claim that for readers in the provinces, quote, the metropolis, in tension with the ethos of the small town, was inescapably present, constitutes a form of mediation of the life world. The sense of the city as a locus of culture, refinement, and danger, indeed the sense of the city as possibility, are the results of reading, for Weinsberg's Ohio's George Willard and for Upstate New York's George Bragdon. Cultural capital. Pierre Bourdieu gives us the term cultural capital, loosely defined as, quotes, accumulated cultural knowledge that confers power and status. Certainly the best instance of the use of reading as a means to cultural capital, although we've had many of these today, right? The best instance of the use of reading as a means to cultural capital that we've seen today came in Lydia Weaver's paper sharing the, to me, poignant tale of Miller obsessively seeking to amass cultural capital in a sheep station in New Zealand. But both of our papers in this session, I think, speak to questions of cultural capital. They both, in fact, raise a fundamental question about cultural capital itself, which is how and on what level is it valued? Is value assessed for it or placed on it? In Joan Rubin's paper, surely George Bragdon was after a form of cultural capital in his literary sociability. As Rubin demonstrates in regard to other topics, Bragdon's situation was complicated here by the imbrication of local institutions and needs with metropolitan connections and desires. The best example of this, and she talked about this in her presentation just now, the best example of this is probably politics, in which the most crucial capital Bragdon needed was solid connections with local Republicans to secure the job printing necessary to make his newspapers profitable. Bragdon's immersion in party politics resulted in what Rubin calls, quote, participation in the wider world. It was participation, however, in the sort of machine politics represented by Roscoe Conkling, a kind of a bare-knuckles political kind of engagement, right? A sort of engagement that to an extent maybe preempted the sort of, quote, broad-mindedness and intellectual refinement that would have constituted the sort of purely cultural capital that might have allowed Bragdon to shake off the provincial dust and perhaps keep it. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is, and I'll throw this to you as a question to you at the end, is there a way in which the kind of bare-knuckled political cosmopolitanism that he had to engage with professionally kept him from polishing himself up enough to really establish himself in New York or Washington? So we can come to that when we we get to you. This is not to say that Bragdon didn't partake in the sort of reading, art consumption, discussion that constitutes pure cultural capital. Indeed, he seems to have been tireless in creating it where he did not find it. Still, his checkered professional career and his comet-like arcs around New York and Washington beg the question of whether he had access to the sort of cultural capital that would have landed him permanently in one of these metropolitan centers. Bringing the question of cultural capital to Brad Evans's paper forces a re-asking of a question crucial to his model, and one that Evans himself asks: what flows along the edges or links within a cluster in the Bibelow's network? And maybe just a moment to just go back to the model that Brad lays out. It's the notion that, like, say, within the cluster in New York, or within the cluster that's constituted between Wausau and Lansing in these Bibelows, there are nodes, and then there are links between the nodes. And in the paper, Brad asks what actually flows along those links. Late in the essay, Evans explains that the links consist of citational work. They sort of coexist by, or the link is made by cross citation between the nodes within the Bibelow movement. And Brad says that style is what flows along these links. Style, quote, develops along the citational lines themselves. Style emanates from the connections themselves, and it depends upon readers capturing the trace of movement. In other words, the style of the Bibelows takes place in the citational practices that form the links in the network. For readers to appreciate what's happening in the style, they need to pick up on at least some of the citations, and thereby recognize the movement between nodes that constitutes the aesthetic of the Bibelows, which is virtually identical with the aesthetic of the network itself. Because of my own interest in mass market magazines, I want to posit a complementary answer to Evans's question about what flows along the links. I want to suggest that simultaneous to style, cultural capital flows along the links. Although in the case of the Bibelows, it's cultural capital of a peculiar kind. This requires that I push back a bit on what Brad calls the differences between the networks of Bibelows and the network constituted among the mainstream monthlies. Like the Atlantic and Collier's and things like that. It is true that, on the one hand, the monthlies reviewed wide variety of works, mostly widely acceptable, works that were widely acceptable in the culture, respectable, etc., and that in contrast, the Bibelows valued works and each other by integrating them into their tight network, right? So sort of by obsessively citing the same thing, they sort of developed the network. In both cases, though, I would suggest that something like cultural capital travels along these edges, albeit cultural capital of different kinds in each case. And in the case of the monthlies and sort of more mass publications, by citing, I'm going to talk about the Bibelows first. By citing a set of other Bibelows, a Bibelow signals its belonging and reiterates the aesthetic of citationality. So by citing the Bibelow says, I'm one of these, right? So it's signaling belonging. The citational practice of a mass market or general circulation monthly, in contrast, reiterates its connection to centers of value. That is, canonical or proto-canonical names, as well as the names of its peer publications. So like the Atlantic cites Harper's, but it also cites the name of an author that has kind of established canonical value at the time. I work in the 1920s, so I'm looking at kind of mass market-y literary magazines and newspapers who kind of obsessively cite Thomas Hardy and Joseph Conrad, right, as a way of kind of establishing not only, commercial value, but also a kind of cultural respectability that's maybe beyond what they can actually achieve. It is true that the monthlies are more oriented, thus, to institutional permanence, to names that stick, and that the Bibelows are dedicated to ephemerality. But something denoting value, in fact, travels along the edges in either case. As you can clearly see, I'm hung up on value. In a way that is related to my sense that the Bibelows constituted an anti-public sphere, the cultural capital they exchange through citationality is kind of a more local currency. Much like Bragdon's bona fides among upstate Republicans, the cultural capital that the Bibelows achieve in citing each other can't be traded on the national market. In fact, they wouldn't want to trade it on the national market. And so the fact that cultural capitals brought me to belonging brings me to my next term, which is imagined communities. Now, everybody knows this term, right? From Benedict Anderson, coined to analyze the ways in which the eventual citizens of modern nation states, separated by space and local social particularities, begin to see themselves as part of a unified polity by repeatedly consuming the fiction of their unity. The fiction of community, the fiction of nation in newspapers. So in other words, people who live in opposite ends of France and speak different provincial dialects read newspapers that are constantly reiterating the notion that they all belong to the same community. The Bibelotists, you pronounce the T, pardon my French. The Bibelotists signaled their publications belonging to a movement associated with modernity by reiterating the citational practices derived from the French Petit Review. And in so doing, they both continuously created their movement and continuously reiterated their belonging to it. Rubin's sense of the continuous psychological presence of the metropolitan within the provincial powerfully attests to Benedict Anderson's insistence that national communities must be imagined, and are imagined specifically through local acts of reading. George Bragdon's sense of connection with Washington and New York was enriched by his physical visits to those places, but one suspects that it needn't have been. In his practices of literary and intellectual sociability, particularly in Rochester and Ithaca, Bragdon seems to have been very successful in constructing for himself a feeling of belonging to an imagined intellectual community that stretched well beyond the borders of New York State. And finally, and I'm going to go into the last set of terms, and I'm going to go through these more quickly. These terms are riskier importations, and for reasons that should be clear, and I'm just going to sort of throw them out there and let them hang. Okay, so performativity. Obviously, the preeminent theorist of performativity is Judith Butler, who argues that identity, particularly gender identity, all of these terms, incidentally, are linked by the notion of identity, the last three terms. So Butler argues that identity, particularly gender identity, is best understood not as a foundation from which we act, but as a continuous series of real-time performances that instantiate our identity on an ongoing variable basis. Gender, Butler writes, is, quote, in no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. While a consideration of the gender complications of the Bibelo fad would run to book length, it does strike me that the phrase stylized repetition of acts neatly expresses the essential and perhaps compulsive citationality of the Bibelos, a citation that unquestionably does instantiate their identity and the identity of the movement itself. While access to the details of Bragdon's sociability practices is probably beyond what the archive will offer, there's undoubtedly a kind of constantly reiterated identity at work in his dogged pursuit of and creation of institutions in which he can perform his quasi-cosmopolitan identity. And finally, double consciousness and hybridity. Both of these have perhaps more obvious, if equally problematic, applications to the metropolitan-provincial dynamic. It seems clear enough that if someone like Bragdon is simultaneously pulled between cosmopolitan desires and interests and beholden to local exigencies, he is, in that sense, a hybrid, if not precisely in the sense that Homi Bhabha traces in Colonial Subjects. And the stereotyped inadequacy that the provincial feels upon his encounters with cosmopolitan or metropolitan subjects, although Bragdon doesn't seem to have experienced this particularly acutely, is also a form of double consciousness, defined by W.E.B. Du Bois as, quote, this feeling of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. In the cases of both hybridity and double consciousness, the power relations underlying their theoretical formulation are much more stark, imperial and racial dominance, respectively. And yet I think it is a potentially productive question to ask to what degree the relationship between I think it's productive to ask to what degree the relation between metropolis and province is an unequal power relation in any setting, and to look at how power is arrayed in different such relations at different historical moments. and how these theoretical concepts, the terms that I've thrown out, might illuminate the metropolitan provincial dialectic that George Bragdon's life both affirms and complicates. Thank you. I'll give our panelists a minute to see if they want to shoot back first, and then we'll open up the dance floor.
I don't want to shoot back. I want to ask Brad a question. Can I do that?
Please.
And it is because I have read something of the work of George Bragdon's son, Claude. And because all I knew of Gillette Burgess, having just pronounced it Burgess, you see that I had to learn from you to pronounce it Burgess even.
But maybe it is Burgess.
I thought you were instructing me that. Okay, I'll go back to Burgess then. At any rate, all I knew was the purple cow, and probably we all knew the purple cow. But that passes so quickly out of whatever oppositional cachet it carried. Furthermore, there is, to me, a kind of clubby, masculine, premium on wit. All of this makes me want to ask just how oppositional, at least the American version of this was.
Thanks. And yes, I think that, let me say, can I answer that by going to the public sphere? Because I think that I use the public sphere here, but more as a rhetorical move. The term I'm more comfortable with is publics. That is, the public sphere runs into the problems of cultural capital that you described, the assumption that it's singular, that it's something that's out there. What I'm describing is really a public, and it's a very particularized form of a public, and it's an aesthetic proto-modernist public. And there are all sorts of different conceptual terms that I've played around with in order to try to describe it. Public is one. Group would be another, simply to call it a group. Where I see the distinction being that a public is a mode of address that imagines itself as being somehow open-ended. When you address a public, you may be addressing particular people, but ultimately it's going to continue to move. Much of this seems like group play. It's what Doug Fine would call a tiny public, which is a group of largely men, but occasionally women. Kate Chopin was very big in this movement. Kate Chopin, the writer of short stories, more than Kate Chopin, the regionalist. Kate Chopin, the feminist, was writing in these magazines. But often it seems to be like a group movement, which I think also lends itself to explaining its ephemerality. That is, if you don't know the group, it's hard to recover any individual from it. You almost have to discover them all as a group in order for any of them to seem in the least bit important. And the only reason that we have Stephen Crane, but it's because he's done some novels too. If we were just to look at Crane as a poet, we probably wouldn't find him without reference to all of these other groups. Counterpublic. I think you're absolutely right that their little revolution did not last, was not terribly counter. It was marginally so. It was to the extent that they were trying to react strenuously, if with wit and a kind of campy sensibility, against Howells, against Frank Norris. Frank Norris is the one guy who ever paid any attention to them because he was friends with Gillette Burgess. And Norris is the great American naturalist who wants more virile stories with blood and sex. It was largely masculinist, largely interested in wit, but not exclusively. And I think that's why I resist a little bit the counter-public move, because this is lightweight stuff. It transforms itself in the 20th century into something that sounds much more, under the aegis of Eliot and Pound, it becomes much more significant. But I think you find in this a kind of transformation of a new kind of attention to the public as a place where assemblages of citation becomes the object of art. And I think that lays the groundwork for what you see in the 20th century. I think it's particularly key for thinking about the emergence of Dada, for example. When Marcel Duchamp does his Fountain, which, by the way, takes place in a modernist little magazine that he puts out. The Fountain is the urinal statue. That whole intervention is staged on the pages of his little magazine, The Blind Man. But if you go back and look at the 90s little magazines, the transformation of the public that makes that seem like an intervention is happening in the 90s. So,
Ken.
Can I pick up on that? You're using the term counter-public here. But in some ways, it seems like you're posing the alternative public in a competitive situation with this here.
Yeah.
And all that is implicit within that, which creates then the problematic then of competing imagined communities that lack prominence.
right. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. In other words, that the public is arguing against an imagined...
The public is an imagined community as you're structuring it.
Yeah.
But you're also posing the notion of the alternative community this here that poses an alternative than imagined community. And again, the competition between these to come out with some sort of end product that is here. Or as we see, alternative network systems that are developing in your analysis.
Yeah. Well, there's no counter-public or alternative imagined community that I guess exists without the original public to push off against, right? It can't just come out of nowhere. So to that extent, I think they are counter or counter-imagined communities. I think what's interesting is that this group imagined itself it's, for some reason, what's impressive about the movement, I guess, to think of it as a movement, is that it can exist so much on this parallel plane. It's clear that the major players like Burgess and Crane and Kate Chopin and others were reading the public that they were counter to. And yet their magazines exist citing themselves and not the others except in the negative. And the major public magazines of the time, The Atlantic and The Century, are not citing the little magazines at all. It's almost as if they don't exist, even though some of the more significant players are publishing in both. And even, I think this becomes interesting geographically when you get to something like Le Quartier Latin, the American little magazine published in Paris, New York, and London, which is clearly enmeshed in this spirit of Montmartre, and yet its mode of address is not to the French Bibelot at all, but to the English and American Bibelot. So I guess what I'd say with that is that and it's something that we've talked about already today, but these publics becomes a kind of nice way to describe them because they can move across national borders and into places like Lansing and Wausau and presumably Muncie, and exist on parallel planes with all sorts of other things that are happening in print and in culture more generally, anthropologically defined, without necessarily linking up with it. It's as if print can go on its own sphere, at least particular print publics, or counter publics, or imagine, ultimately that set of terms, they interact. The important thing is to imagine that it's all networked, and they're networking with particular groups, and sometimes it's like this, and sometimes.
Christopher.
Actually, I want to start with an appreciation and then put out a pair of questions. The Crane stuff absolutely fascinates me. At my college, we have a big Stephen Crane collection because he went there for a semester before he went to Syracuse and gave up college. And I was always floored by how gorgeous and kind of not fittingly gorgeous the first edition of Black Riders is, and this just put it in perspective for me. So yeah, thanks so much for helping figure where that poetry is coming from and coming through to get to the point where it's in the book. One question that I have for you, Brad, is how earlier forms of bohemianism, thinking, say the Fox group, these kinds of, and the kinds of underground press that they're producing. How are these? So that these guys are looking to Paris, but like you say, they're also quoting Whitman. So how much is that earlier bohemianism bubbling up through this? Yeah. And the question that I have for Joan does maybe a similar move. I love your idea of how you can be cosmopolitan on the terms of these different places, and it got me thinking about when and in what way did Concord, Massachusetts become cosmopolitan? Because thinking of Emerson as one of the kind of gateways for Bragdon, Emerson was this weird guy in Concord when he started, and at some point he became cosmopolitan. And I'm not sure when that switch happens. So you get me thinking of it. How is Concord, Massachusetts maybe just another version of what you've been describing here, upstate New York? It's just that we keep reading the stuff from Concord.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question.
Excuse me, Joan, could you take your mic and somewhere? I can't hear exactly, but all I hear is like sweater noise.
Sweater noise. Okay, is this better? I think when I got up, I must have flipped over. Do you want to see if that's better? Is that better?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I don't know. I mean, right. There'd be the story of Emerson as a kind of popular possession, and there'd be the story of Concord as a place. And I don't know enough to answer that. But
I feel I now need to go back and think about this.
yeah.
I pulled up Crane real quickly just because I don't know, you won't recognize it, but the little illustration is Denslow. He illustrated The Wizard of Oz a few years later. And just to say, the way that I think that this is quoting both Baudelaire and Whitman is not just comrade brother, which I think is clearly a reference to Hypocrite Lecture, but it's also a temperance poem to a certain extent. At least you could read this as a temperance poem. I stood upon a high place and saw below many devils running, leaping, and carousing in sin. One looked up grinning and said, "Comrade, brother." Right? And so it's a little bit of temperance poem, which Whitman wrote a temperance novel before he became a poet. And so I think it's very elaborate. I think I go on quite long in this one. Its relationship to other bohemian movements is kind of interesting, and to tell this story, I would go back actually to other magazine public or counter-publics. In a way, they're a little bit like The Spectator, in that they're trying to establish a lot of self-reflexivity in their publication form, right? And so when Michael Warner describes the public and The Spectator as being the originator of that, you can see these moving up and percolating. The strange thing is, though, that they're very much in their moment. And I suppose the answer to the other Bohemian question would be that each Bohemia has to imagine itself in its moment against the other prevailing dominant publics that they see existing. And so it's a little bit surprising not to see them referring more directly back to prior moments. The Bohemianism, the people that use the word the most is Burgess and his group. They're San Francisco Bohemians. So it's the whole San Francisco scene, which is where Vagabondia comes.
Right.
And Bliss Carman, who wrote the Vagabondia, was the editor of the first editor of the chapbook.
Right.
So this is a very tight community, imagining itself there. But I think that the way that they're getting a lot of it is my hunch is the way this all took off is that any time a young man, typically a young man, but on occasion a young woman goes to Paris and they see the Chat Noir, and then they head back to wherever they are and they start doing them themselves. That's why Rabindranath Tagore, who was traveling in Europe and then goes back to India and starts publishing a little magazine, it makes a lot of sense to think of it that way. They saw themselves very much in the moment. Burgess was a professor at, let's see, I'm going to get it wrong. I don't think it was Berkeley, but the California Institute of Technology for a little bit, and he got himself fired for knocking down a statue because he thought the statue was too ugly, and knocked it down in a sign of protest, and then started these little magazines. Ended up moving to New York, which is where he became friends, I presume, with Claude, and published lots of novels. But he didn't stay the bohemian. He published light reading. 20 novels, and I was telling Laura before, he published The Goops, which some of you have kids might know. Goops and How Not to Be Them. It's a manners book of manners for kids. Don't be a goop. Goops pick their nose in public. Don't be a goop.
Frank.
One of the things, Pat, that you picked up so much in your response, and I enjoyed that a great deal, but you didn't say very much about ephemerality, and I wonder whether one could think about, and it's an area I don't know, so perhaps what I'm saying is not going to work, but the text that you've shown us in the Below and so on seems to be the most ephemeral aspect. What I find far more interesting is the representation of images and also the typographical innovations which are there. And I think that in some ways one might want to link the two papers, because a figure that you mentioned who's so important for Le Chat Noir is Théophile Steinlen, who really is the person one thinks about first when you think about Le Chat Noir. And
black cat.
yes, exactly. But Steinlen was also an influence on a number of American book illustrators, including and especially one that Joan talked about, and that is William Thomas Smedley. And Smedley went on to illustrate Henry James. He was, I think, in Harper's Magazine and various other things. Very, very conventional images, but you can see the influence of people like Steinlen there, and possibly also Toulouse-Lautrec. So I wondered whether the two of you could talk about the visual aspect. And perhaps just one other final point. What travels, and how can one relate that to Muncie, Indiana? Well, I think you're right. I don't know of any Bibelot that were published here. But there were, in the early 20th century, there were a number of souvenir magazines or souvenir brochures that were produced to promote Muncie as a small city. And there's one particular one you might like to look at. We have it online again in that digital media repository, which I think is called Magic City. And it's worthwhile looking at the images and also the typography which is being used there. There are parallels, and I think there is some influence. So, could I ask you to talk about the visual aspects?
Sure. The closest Anglo-American predecessor, I think, is coming out of the arts and crafts movement and the decorated book. But the group illustrating these magazines, I think, is imagining themselves with a very different set of relations to that. It may have started there, and the Jensen type, which is so popular in these magazines, started there. But it moves very quickly to a different kind of thing, more associated with Steinlen and Toulouse-Lautrec and the art coming out of Paris. And the big figure there is Aubrey Beardsley. Mm-hmm. So it's all extremely Beardsley-esque. And the Yellow Book is it's kind of an Bibelot in my estimation. It's almost too big and too successful to count, in the same way that the chapbook is, the American chapbook is a little bit too big and too important. But the artists who are doing this in the 1890s, alongside the Bibelot movement, there was a craze for posters. And all of the major magazines were publishing posters at the same time, Harper's and Century and all of them. And the big figures there were Will Bradley, Maxfield Parrish, Edward Penfield, Louis Reed. These are poster artists largely trained in Paris and working in this kind of Toulouse-Latrecian Japonism style. And you see, they are remarkable. I have to say that the reason I started working on these was, well, first I found Le Chat Noir in the basement of the Rutgers Art Museum, and then started realizing the connections, mostly with the Vogue model. Kate Chopin was publishing in Vogue all the time. Vogue is the same Vogue as today, but in this moment it was a publication that was both interested in society, but it was really a new woman publication. They had articles against marriage, for women having careers, against the marriage market. The edges of Vogue magazine were decorated by Louis Reed, who was just an extraordinary visual artist in exactly this mode. And it's really a gorgeous magazine up to 1900. It gets bought by Condé Nast in 1910. So you have to look at the pre-1900 Vogue magazines. They're just remarkable examples of this Art Nouveau style. Now the art becomes a way of it is itself a citational mode. I mean, everybody's the Art Nouveau, the woman who blends into her dress, which blends into a flower, that kind of objectification of female form alongside visual form, that becomes itself a kind of style that's shared. It's a citational reference. And that style really marks all of these. They're absolutely gorgeous things. So, yeah.
Joan, do you want to say something about typography and images?
Well, actually, I can't really answer your question, Frank, except to say that there's quite an absence of an interest in the visual in George Bragdon's own archive, and yet his son becomes both an illustrator and then an architect and then eventually a theater designer. So maybe now is the time for me to say that when I was thinking about this conference, I was going to work on the son at first, and I took a detour to the father, partly because Claude Bragdon takes the occult and theosophical interests of his father even further and marries a second wife who is a medium and is very. I'm actually quite put off by his interest in these matters. But your question has made me think that, and Brad's paper has made me think that it's time for me to look at the sun now.
I thought it was so interesting. You said that at one point, you just passing, you said he conversed with.
He meets Smedley,
W.T. Smedley, Charles Sam, C.S.
Yes,
I'd be fascinated to know a little bit more about that if one can.
Right. Well, I don't think there was more about that in the archive, but that's in the sort of club life that he has some entree into New York. There's this kind of overlap then with what Brad was talking about.
I've got to admit, I don't know Smedley himself, so these magazines are happening during the golden age of magazine illustration.
Right.
So the Century, Harper's, The Atlantic is not illustrated. That was its claim to fame. But Century, Scribner's, these are magnificently illustrated, but in an entirely different style than what these are doing.
Right.
They were into the Winslow Homeresque, largely realist images.
Right. But what's interesting is I guess I said this about the Purple Cow, but it's that the text, some of these texts get separated from the illustration, and that's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
How that happens and
something like.
I mean, Ladies' Home Journal asks, who are the 10 most popular poets? I can't remember the year of this. This is in my poetry book, and the Purple Cow is up there, like at the top of the list.
Burgess is known for his one poem for goops and for coining the word blurred.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting.
Laura?
So I have a question which really comes out of my own deep ignorance of almost anything related to transatlantic print culture, because really I'm just trained as a Latin American social historian. So, but bear with me on this. I'm wondering about the meaning of cosmopolitan in this place and time, and in particular the racialized coordinates of the term cosmopolitan, sort of in contrast to metropolitan. So let's say in the text that, in the newspapers I read, which were mainly published by black people in the 1920s, cosmopolitan has a very particular meaning that is, it's contrasted with sort of racial loyalties, or so it's sort of the things that transcend national and racial loyalties, and that eschew racism tend to be tagged as cosmopolitan. And sort of conversely, someone like Lothrop Stoddard, the white supremacist, white supremacist refers to misguided cosmopolitan enthusiasts putting open borders above the importance of racial duty. So when I hear cosmopolitan, I hear this sort of implicit judgment about racialism within that, but I don't know if that's just in my little corner of the world and it's not in the broader world.
Well, so I thought that it would be important to try to recover what the meaning of cosmopolitan was for people at the time that I was writing about, and I could not get very far in that effort, and that's why I said I wanted to raise this problem of language. So what I did learn was that the term, as I said, it's appropriated for Cosmopolitan magazine, which is the same magazine that we have today, but it was started out as a family magazine in Rochester, ironically, but I couldn't find any documents that explained why that title was chosen. That's what I would love to have found. Similarly, these cosmopolitan clubs or the Cosmopolitan Conference that Bragdon goes to, that I talk about in the paper, and that's why I said it seems in those usages anyway simply to mean progressive or forward-looking or worldly. I think worldly might be a useful term for your guys too, actually. But that's as far as I could get with that, and then I'm well aware that a figure like Horace Callan comes along, or people who write about transnational America, Randolph Bourne, and so on, later. But I hit a wall.
Jim?
Connected to that, since I read your paper and then again when I heard Pat's comment, I've been sort of mulling over the fact that of all people to appear at this conference, we have Roscoe Conkling. It's not a name that I ever expected to involve over this weekend. And it was really striking to me that he's seen as the connection to him is seen as an example of a kind of cosmopolitan connection or experience or access to big city life.
Partly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's a double-edged sword in a number
Right.
of ways. 'Cause of
Well,
course
that's what
right.
you were
The point, this is the
suggesting.
point Pat made, is he's the epitome
Yeah.
of
Backroom.
corruption. But in backroom dealing
Yeah.
and all of that. But it speaks also to this issue of what does it mean to be cosmopolitan, because at that moment, Conkling's big critics are liberal reformers and a sort of a transatlantic
Right.
group who imagine themselves as the real cosmopolitans.
And Bragdon, he meets George William Curtis, and he
Right, that's right,
recommends
yeah.
George William Curtis and the Nation, and so on. So it's in tension, to say the least.
Right, but then the
with this
moderns that come
relationship.
along a little bit after are rebelling
Yeah.
against these transatlantic liberals in certain ways and positioning themselves as in opposition to them and imagining themselves as they're the cosmopolitans, and now all of a sudden the cosmopolitan
Right.
critics of Conkling. I mean, it's just very striking to me that,
Right.
that it speaks to the slipperiness of this, that it cuts in so many ways when you start to make these connections. I'm not unsympathetic to the point you're making. It's just I think it's really striking how complicated it gets when you try to sort all this out.
Yeah. If I could hop in there, I thought it was great the way that the National ends up serving Cosmopolitan ends to a certain extent for a regional figure. But to complicate things, the term that had some literary purchase in the late 80s and 1890s was provincialism, which
Yes.
Hamlin Garland proposed as what American authors ought to be doing
Right.
in order to become more cosmopolitan, which is to say,
Right.
he felt that Americans were imitating Europeans to such a large extent that, in fact, what American writers needed to do was become more local. And this kind of regional emphasis that Garland promoted, and then that you see kind of sprouting in 1880s, 1890s
Right.
American regional fiction, both by women and African Americans. Every region had their local flavor and their local dialect, and it was provincial by design in order to establish America's place on the world literary stage. So that gets quite complicated,
Complicated
even more
also.
complicated,
Right.
even more quickly.
Right.
All I can say is my Bibelatists were reacting against Garland's provincializing. They didn't buy into it at all. You won't find any dialect fiction in any of this. Even though that hits its height in 1896, the year of Plessy v. Ferguson, they're oblivious to race. And you could use that against them. Well, what about their obliviousness to race? They simply are not interested.
But they do. I mean, to check another term on the end of Patrick's list, it is mimicry, isn't it? So I mean, there's a very kind of powerful. There's a power relation being enacted all the time, especially in your example of Le Chat Noir, where you see that figure getting repeated, and there's a kind of a recognition of an elite tier of these little magazines, and then the mimicry of the provincial ones. I mean, it's quite a muddled scene in that way.
Absolutely.
I'm just struck by thinking forward to something like Rhythm, or any of the little. I mean, I thought it was lovely prelude to the little modernist magazines that you made, because they start off as groups, and then they stop doing that completely. So and I mean, I suppose the question.
What do you mean by?
Well, I was thinking particularly about the Bloomsbury group. That has this kind of pretense of being a group in a way, doesn't it? Because they all then become highly individualised, personally celebrated. They have sort of shared artistic ideals, but in comparison to I don't know anything about the people you're talking about. I must say, this is a completely blank area for me. But
Nobody does.
that's sort of my point in a way. I mean, all the little modernist magazines breed these stars, don't they? So it stops being a collective enterprise in a way. Whereas yours, I was very struck by the fact that you said nobody knew anything much about them and they were so under-discussed. And I sort of think, well, there's got to be a set of quite powerful explanations about that too.
the modernist magazine, the big modernist magazines, I think worked to obscure this prior moment.
Right.
So Stephen Crane is a great example. Again, Amy Lowell said that the reason that nobody knows about Stephen Crane's poetry is because it was published in the Philistine. Now, the Philistine has a long history because the Philistine goes on to become famous because its editor, Hubbard, pens a little thing called A Message to Garcia,
Yeah.
which becomes one of the best-selling pamphlets of the early 20th century, and he ends up becoming an advertiser for himself, and the Philistine becomes something rather different. But Lowell insists that the reason that nobody knows Crane's poetry is because it was published in the Philistine, and then it has these pretty covers on the Black Riders and War is Kind. It also has these illustrated editions that gets in the way of the poetry. So she blames this prior moment. And there is, in a lot of ways, this is like a prior movement to the little magazines, but without the overblown personas of Pound, Eliot, Amy Lowell, and the others. The authors are, you had mentioned cultural capital, and in an odd way, these guys have cultural capital by not pursuing cultural capital. I mean, Burgess is a really successful unknown author. You know, he publishes 20 volumes, and I think he lives a pleasant life. And alongside all of the major modernists.
But he's not considered serious.
He's not. No, that's right. And he didn't want to be. That was his intervention, was to not. You know, it was to be a lark, right? The lark was a joke. That was its movement.
Well, one of the reasons why the modernists obscured this moment too is because of its connotations of homosexuality, especially in the English context. I mean, the Beardsley drawing has that taint, and that's one of the reasons why it disappears from accounts of modernism really early.
Yeah, I've wanted so much to be able to do a queer reading of this, and you can, but not explicitly, because these men were for the most part all married. I don't think it was not an explicitly gay scene.
Right.
Though I think it's there. It's completely campy, right?
Yes,
it is entirely campy.
Wild was lurking there all
And
the time.
Wilde is there all the time,
Right.
and Stevie Crane is hanging out with Wilde when he's living in England, though Crane notoriously is very public about his rejection of
And
Wilde's
everybody's hanging
homosexuality.
out with them in their heads.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So,
Other questions? Mark?
Joan, just if we go back to almost where you started, which was this idea of the provincial newspaper as a vehicle for extracting other provincial newspapers, which in a sense is a kind of citational practice in itself, isn't it? And in one sense, perhaps we assume that the local extracts the regional, and then perhaps the metropolitan, and then the international, and we see those kind of citational links as expanding outwards to create the kind of cosmopolitan frame of reference that you talked about. But I guess at the same time, there's always the lateral movement, the kind of the citational practice which takes other locals and constructs difference and similarity and community and dissonance around different sorts of experience in other local or provincial kind of contexts. And I just wondered whether you had any real sense, or whether you thought it would be worthwhile trying to map those kinds of lines of citational influence, in a kind of analogous way to the kind of way that Brad was talking about.
I'm not sure I understood your point, the second part of what you said about the additional localisms.
Well, I suppose my question really is that we've got an upstate New York paper,
Right.
Which might cite the New York Times,
Right.
it might cite the London
Right.
Times,
Or it might cite other local papers.
or it might cite the other upstate New York papers.
That's right.
It might
And it
also
does.
cite other forms of, or similar
Right.
forms of local papers from elsewhere in the
Right.
States, and indeed it might cite potentially local papers from the UK.
Yes.
And in doing so, those kind of forms of citational practice are creating different forms of connections or disconnections depending on what is being cited and for what.
So I think it very much depends on what is being cited. And I was thinking that, I made this point about the exchange because it did seem to me to be a kind of institutional vehicle for the construction of a wider world. Can I say cosmopolitan again? And yet, if you look at the actual items in the Adams Visitor, some of them are what we would call human interest stories, or oddities,
Cow with 2
curiosities.
heads born in Brighton. Cow with 2 heads born in
Cow,
Brighton.
cow with 2 heads born in Brighton, right? Purple cow born, right? So I think certainly that kind of mapping would be instructive, but not by itself. I think we'd have to look at the actual contents, which no one person could do, I suppose. But yes, that might be.
I mean, I guess one of the questions is this citation, kind of stories for Ripley's, or is it?
Well, it's both. It's new, sort of hard news, what we would call hard news, and then it's filler, interesting items from all over.
Lots of weird crimes.
Weird crimes, suicides.
Well, I wonder about, the exchange. Is this sort of almost happenstance imagined community? Or like this happenstance institution of imagined community? It goes around to all the little papers. It gives them a common sort of set of things to play from. And in that sense, it is kind of creating the sense that we all live in the same world.
Right. Well, and then if you add in the ready print innards, which Bragdon's papers actually didn't use, but that would be even more kind of strengthening of that community.
I don't know whether it works, but the getting it to Muncie again, or to any of these regional places, I think that the interesting thing that happens is that if it's an imagined community, it can happen in print. And I think that so often, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century periods, the urban centers become such the imagined locale where all of this has to happen. There's the idea that you have to be part of a cafe in New York or a cabaret in Paris in order to get the urban feel out of which you would produce something like a modern poem. But in fact, all that you need is a good citational practice, and it can happen.
Right.
It can
I
happen.
ran across a really cool illustration of that in the work we're doing now. There was a decadent poet, Le Gallienne, I think is his name.
Richard Le Gallienne.
He gave a lecture in New York, and it was a little blurb. It was written up in one of the Muncie papers. I forget which one. But what's interesting is it's full of Le Gallienne came to see us. We did this. We did that. And what had happened is the editor just lifted this account from a New York paper and plunked it into the Muncie paper with no reference to New York. If you don't know, I had to read it 3 times to realize that this didn't actually take place in Muncie. This guy came here. And so it was really, I don't know if it was an accident on the part of the editors or if it was a purposeful attempt to identify with this and say, we're part of this same thing. It's past 5, so I want to invite, first of all, say thanks to everyone, Pat, and
What a talk.
a couple of things real quickly.